Hello, and welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll be discussing the recently called forthcoming UK election, just over a month away, and two recent controversies. One in Germany regarding the resurrection of a 1999 techno anthem with a new set of spontaneous lyrics, and the other in Rome, as Pope Francis is accused and apologises for using a homophobic slur in a private meeting of 250 bishops. I'm your host, Nina Power, and I'm joined today by Sohrab Ahmari, Matthew Schmitz, and Geoff Shullenberger. So, a few days ago, the current British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, called a general election for July the 4th, American Independence Day, perhaps because he'd rather get it over with quickly so he can have a summer holiday. The Conservatives have been in government for 14 years. Sunak currently has a 69% disapproval rate, and the Tories are polling at around 23% of the likely vote. Labour, under Keir Starmer, are, pending unforeseen calamity, widely expected to get in. In Compact, we recently published an article by Dan Hitchens tracing Starmer's political development and character. And Hitchens memorably describes Starmer as, quote, the purest of technocrats, a legal bureaucrat with a 5-star CV whose metallic monotone gives the impression that you might accidentally connect to him via Bluetooth. There is not much enthusiasm for the election here, it has to be said. And it feels like Labour will win, if only because they're not the Tories. Not because they have any positive vision for Britain. But I'm curious, how is the UK election looking from the US?
Less about the election than looking back over the past 14 years of, largely pretty awful Tory governance. I mean, in other words, there may be moments, there may be things that you might think, okay, this is a policy achievement or whatever. But if you sum up the whole 14 years, it's a pretty dire picture. You had, first of all, an austerity plan. I mean, in other words, just where rates were low and Britain could invest in its public infrastructure, et cetera, the Cameron, and then briefly the kind of coalition Cameron Lib Dem government, and later Cameron on his own, just became quite stringent, which doesn't make any sense. And then you had the rolling disaster of Boris's premiership. It was just such a mess, and obviously he couldn't hold it together as a governance, and that was a problem that I think everyone saw coming. If you know Boris's character, and then you have this return from this brief populist-ish interlude from circa 2016 to last year, and then you have the return of basically the kind of Cameronite establishment in the form of Rishi, and of course in the person of David Cameron himself, now ennobled and serving as foreign secretary. The one thing you can give them credit for, I think, is just acceding to put Brexit to a vote, the referendum, and that was done. Of course, Cameron thought he would. He thought that Remain would resoundingly win. He didn't expect. He was surprised as anyone by the actual outcome. But other than that, what have the Tories achieved? I mean, austerity, the NHS in terrible shape, getting into America's various pointless Mideast adventures. Socially, conserving nothing. I mean, it's as a socially liberal a party as any you can imagine. I mean, I remember when I was there and just covering issues related to religious freedom of traditionalist minded Christians, Jews, and Catholics coming under pressure from Tory officials, the same way they would under a Labour or another. Of course, the complete kind of rolling over for the gender ideology, which is now being rolled back, but that's no thanks really to Tories as a governing party. So it's just a really pretty loud. I always say it's probably the worst right of center party in the developed world are the Tories, at least as they're currently constituted, and they're gonna. It looks like they're gonna go into like the political wilderness for a while, and I think it's kind of well deserved. I don't have anything to say about like what Starmer represents that Dan Hitchens didn't say. I love that Bluetooth line, but it's fun. It's kind of interesting to look back. Like, what did the Tories do?
I don't have that much to add, but I will recall a line from the wonderful 1980s cult film Withnail and I, in which is actually set in the final days of 1969, in which two young aspiring actors take a disastrous trip to the country home of the uncle of one of them, and in any case, the uncle, the wonderful Richard Griffiths, playing Montague Withnail, has the following monologue, which I will quote at length, and I think it sums up this moment. The old order changeth, yielding place to new. God fulfills himself in many ways. Oh, my boys, we're at the end of an age. We live in a land of weather forecasts and breakfasts that set in, shat on by Tories, shoveled up by Labor. So I think that more or less captures our moment, or at least your moment, Nina. You've been shat on by Tories for 14 years now. You're about to be shoveled up by Labor. So in any case, I think that one of the many prophetic lines of Withnail and I, which I highly recommend to listeners if they've never seen it.
Tories have had what seems from this distance to be a kind of rotating cast of these sort of kind of mannequins who are often trying to imitate some previous prime minister. David Cameron is some kind of odd Tony Blair impersonator. This woman named Liz Truss briefly appeared on the stage and pretended to be Margaret Thatcher. She came to the U.S. I really don't know why, to speak at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, where she said that conservatives in the US and the UK need, quote, a bigger bazooka to fight the left. And conservatives in the US need to look at the British Tory party and think really hard about where they would be without a figure like Donald Trump. Boris Johnson was this somewhat chaotic politician who wasn't altogether ideologically coherent, but had a certain popular touch and got behind Brexit. A lot of parallels between him and Trump. Yep. And then the kind of strange mop of blondish hair for both men. But after Boris was ousted under rather dodgy circumstances, the Tories became this kind of soulless and rather unpopular party. And I think for all his faults, they really missed something without Boris. And the same goes for Trump. I mean, without him at the head of the party, I don't know where the GOP would be today.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys have said. I mean, yeah, the Tories presided over gay marriage, austerity, Brexit, lockdowns, massive immigration, which people voted against at every opportunity, but none of that was demonstrated in Tory policy, despite the claims to limit or restrict immigration. We saw ideological capture of the civil service, collapsing infrastructure. I wrote about it in my last column. The sort of inability of institutions to do what they're supposed to do. Impossible housing costs, very, very punishing existence for young people, particularly in the big cities. Multiple leaders, including Liz Truss, as Matthew mentioned, on 49 days. I believe she's the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history. I think of her as kind of like a Lady Jane Grey character. She tried to do something with the markets. The city said no. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is proposing economic stability, secure borders, and strong defence, which sounds actually remarkably robust. But I think In reality, what we will see is a very weak Labour government that will not be able to stand up to the city, will not do anything to improve economic conditions for young people in particular, and people who want to start families. I think we've seen these people punished relentlessly, millennials and now Zoomers. He claims he's going to set up a new office for value for money, which is sounds very British in a way, sort of ministry of sensible spending. Um, so hopefully my dried apricots will stop costing £3.79, which is a massive ripoff. The country is very, very, very expensive and frankly quite depressing place to be. Anyway, elsewhere in Europe, controversy in Germany as a chant over an old tepid club song entitled L'amour toujours, Love Always or Love Forever, by Gigi D'Agostino goes viral. The chant is Ausländer raus, which means foreigners out, and Deutschland den Deutschen, Germany for the Germans. Various videos of people chanting these phrases have been widely circulated online, though some have apparently been on TikTok for months. There's been a severe response from the German media, who have doxed people who have then lost their jobs. The federal chancellor Olaf Scholz has said that there should be no tolerance for the chant, and the Bundestag president Barbara Bass has even called for 5 years in prison for the chanters under incitement laws. The more the politicians seek to condemn, however, the more the chant's popularity seems to grow, and the original tune is now at number 1 in the German charts. Are people allowed to express anti-immigrant and nationalist feeling? Is the German media and political class making this whole phenomenon worse? What do we think?
I defer to the man with the last name Schmitz.
Yeah, I'll say my own knowledge of Germany extends mainly from talking to my grandfather just very briefly about his experience of being one of the GIs who conquered that country and brought an end to the Third Reich with a little help from U.S. allies. But looking at this whole controversy, at the response from Olaf Scholz, Germany's leader, I'm struck by how different Germany's political culture is from my own notion of how a political culture should work. And that reflects very real differences in circumstance and history. There was a Third Reich in Germany. They don't have America's traditions of free speech as reflected in our First Amendment. But I was also struck by what I see as a convergence between the two societies. As I said, Germany doesn't have a First Amendment. There are very tight, formal, explicit limits on political speech, and trespassing them leads to very serious consequences. And something like, an attempt to build a regime like that is underway in the United States. It can't be constructed on formal terms because of our First Amendment, but that can turn into a mere paper protection when we have private companies regulating speech, or there's a phenomenon, such as cancel culture, as it's often called, where these penalties seem to be very harsh, even when they aren't administered through the formal justice system. So I do think that there are a lot of policymakers in the US and elsewhere that look at a legal regime like Germany's, where you can go to jail for 5 years for saying something unapproved. I think that's good, and we need more of that in the United States. And I think this is where wars of memory or of national history become quite important. Since the New York Times Magazine's publication of the 1619 Project, there has been a massive effort underway to recast the history of the United States as one of constant racism or constant fascism, and all of this is providing an ideological justification for a speech regime like Germany's, which is justified with reference to the Third Reich. So to whatever extent U.S. history comes to be seen as analogous to that of Germany, to whatever extent racism, white supremacy, fascism is seen as always bubbling up in our society and about to spill over, then tight speech controls are going to be justified. And so we have to obviously defend the formal legal protections that we happily enjoy. And there are lawyers doing that, but we also have to engage in, a rigorous, factually based way in wars of memory that are aimed at presenting our society in the exact same light as the society that my grandfather fought and helped to defeat.
Yeah, I think that the specific German historical context that Matthew touches on is very, very important here. Basically, post 1945, West Germany, whose political class then came on to take over the whole of reunified Germany after the collapse of the wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, was based on this idea of an absolute protection of a set of constitutional values and constitutional norms embedded in the post 1945 constitution, and there were lots of security apparatus elements that were out to suppress challenges to that constitutional order from the left and the right, so that there was a severe crackdown, of course, on left groups in the 1960s and 70s, and concurrently on any kind of remnants of the far right, or whatever you want to call it, in the 1950s and hence. And so that's the kind of context in which this is happening. And I think there's something to be said for that, right? Like, this is a country that, it cannot escape its history any more than any other can escape its history. And this is a country that wreaked havoc across Europe, and its actions ended up in the kind of horrors of Auschwitz. It's kind of drive toward racial purification, and so that sort of makes sense. But I think that what we're seeing now, generations after the fact, is that merely a kind of negative construction of identity. I think like a figure like Jan Werner Müller at Princeton has tried to articulate what this means, and he's drawing from an older tradition of what people call, in a specific German tradition, of constitutional patriotism. That is, what is the basis for the citizens' attachment to this constitutional order? It can't be nationalism in Germany. That's obviously ruled out. Of course, these theorists would rule out nationalism in all contexts, and including liberal nationalism. And so what other options are there? One is like total cosmopolitanism, which never quite works, because at the end of the day, you still have a state. So this idea of constitutional patriotism is that your attachment is to the norms enshrined in the constitutional order, not just the Constitution as like the legal document, but the sort of regime, the constitutional regime that came out. And in the German context, that post 1945, that means a kind of a constitutional order that's very, very allergic to anything from the hard right or left. And there's something respectable about that, but it's clearly not enough. Generations after the fact, if the basis of your constitutional order is not X, not Y, not Z, rather than, well, what is it positively for, including a sense of belonging in Germany. What does it mean to be a German? That's still, a state has to, a constitutional order has to give an answer to that. And if the answer is just, we were once very, very bad, and we're determined not to be bad again, that might be valuable as a baseline, but it's not. There's something more needed for people to feel belonging. And that's in this kind of order, as the generations kind of succeed each other, is struggling to come up with a good answer to that. The only other and I think we're seeing that. The only other thing I would say is that it's interesting in the sense that after October 7th, Germany's entire establishment was horrified by some of the rhetoric emerging from mainly kind of immigrant communities who were cheering Hamas. And we're talking about October 8th, 9th, in the immediate wake of the Hamas atrocities. And the entire establishment came down like a ton of bricks on that. And I think what we said on this podcast at the time is, it's almost like the liberal center is also fed up with ill-assimilated or unassimilable migrant communities across Europe, including in Germany. And like in October 7th, they found a way to vent that, such that I don't know if you guys remember, but Robert Habeck, the vice chancellor, released this video, very articulate video, specifically with English subtitles, in which he said, Israel is Germany's ally. Germany has a special responsibility to the Jewish state. And basically, if you don't like it, you face jail and potentially deportation. You do not belong if you don't, as a citizen, give a kind of, even a more than just keeping quiet about it, a kind of positive accession to the German norms about, for example, Jews and Israel. And I think we said here, or maybe we just said it in our private discussions, but that was like a way for liberals to say, look, we've now found a way to like vent what wider society is feeling about ill-assimilated migrant communities. And so in a way, the song is also voicing the same thing. And I think, so long as the underlying issue is not addressed, which is too much migration, and then no pressure on migrants to assimilate, no matter, fine, they gave a speech, but that actually result in anything, the problem will continue, and sort of suppressing popular expressions of frustration with this phenomenon of criminality among migrant communities, of simply just too many. It's a genuine and reasonable thing to be concerned about. You're going to continue to have this problem, and you're going to, undermine more that sort of constitutional order that is committed to keeping out extreme voices. You're going to get more of it. The thing to do from the center is to grant more substantively to those voices of frustration. Sorry, that was a long answer.
It's seemingly a problem in German history that it goes back to this point about the constitutional order, but the question of whether it's a nation or an empire, right? It's historically had relatively short periods in which it's functioned as something like a nation state, and arguably the current configuration of Germany is as the center of a new empire, right? Which is the empire of the European Union, of which Germany is kind of the central state, and sort of anchors it fiscally, institutionally, etc. And this was very clear 10 to 15 years ago at the Euro crisis, and where the sort of backlash against the EU austerity policies imposed on Southern Europe in particular after the crash was expressed as a kind of anti-imperial sentiment, right? And in fact, places like Greece kind of were harking back to periods of direct German domination under the Nazis, as kind of the precursor to what they were, their sort of subjugation under the European Union. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that it's a country that historically was for a long time, part or much of what is now Germany was comprised by the Holy Roman Empire. And then there, it sort of emerges as a nationalist hotbed in reaction to the Napoleonic Wars. But, repeatedly it kind of, asserts itself as an empire, as the Reich, this is now associated with the Nazi era, but in fact, it was of course the Reich under the Kaiser as well. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's sort of a problem of self-definition here, and if you're an empire, then and I don't know. I mean, I think we've kind of strayed from the the initial prompt having to do with the pop song, but Europe is. I watched the Eurovision Song Contest a few weeks ago, which I could go into, but it's if you just think about this song, it's like there's this long history of Europe in the post-war era kind of being invaded by American popular culture. And so when you listen to like Eurovision entries, they tend to just have this kind of weirdly generic kind of quality of just kind of generic pop music that is kind of from nowhere and has no particular it just it's kind of emblematic of this like placelessness of this sort of commercial cosmopolitan culture that comes into being in the late 20th century. And so I think Germany is both it's a kind of and we've published several things to this effect that Western Europe really remains a kind of in many ways subordinate and subjugated by American empire. But the reality is really still that of imperial, kind of transnational political entities. And this song is itself kind of emblematic of this weird kind of flux of kind of identityless, just kind of generic sort of cultural material that kind of comes from nowhere and is destined to nowhere in particular. And so then it's sort of being overlaid by this this sort of nationalist message, demanding a kind of purification. I think is just it's in a way just kind of the latest in this general contest between a model of culture in which there's just this kind of infinite flux of kind of generic kind of kind of generic abstract materials that can kind of be remolded and repurposed and reused in different contexts, and then the attempt to kind of reassert, usually in a sort of futile and ultimately self-defeating way, some sort of claim to place and particularity. But of course the irony is that it's being overlaid on this material that whose very definition is its kind of possibility of being endlessly recycled and resignified. So I don't know, that's all kind of abstract, but I think it does at least I wanted to revisit the question of this song.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's important to note, I think, that as Matthew mentioned already, that there are very strict censorship laws in Germany and Austria around particular songs already. So, for example, specifically the Horst Wessel Lied, which is the Nazi party anthem, has been banned in both countries since the end of World War II. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with these videos is the fact that World War II ended almost 80 years ago, and that young people, precisely as Sohrab said, you can't really keep negatively constituting a national identity around something like guilt. And so young people are thinking, well, this was 80 years ago. This is nothing to do with me, right? It's not my fault. I wasn't a Nazi. And I think that kind of sort of ancestral or historical national pressure is crumbling, is collapsing. And this kind of transgression, and the law creates desire, as St. Paul says in the Bible, right? Including the desire to transgress. Like, young people are always going to transgress somehow against implicit or explicit social and cultural rules. So I think there is this kind of libidinal aspect to this, which is simply saying, like, I'm not saying that all the people chanting really agree with the slogan, but what they're perhaps doing is saying something like, this isn't our fault, right? Like, we don't have to bear this burden in the same way of guilt, like, or it's not really fair to keep doing this. And here is a kind of expression of that frustration with this negative identity. So, sticking with Europe, finally, the Vatican has recently issued an apology over the 87-year-old Pope Francis's use of a homophobic slur during a discussion with bishops in Rome. The word is frocagine, which roughly translates as faggotry, although our producer Stephen says that the word is perhaps more gentle, is more like pansy, maybe more, it's like a flower, a floral reference. But in the press, it's been translated as faggotry. In the Pope's apology, he said he never intended to express himself in homophobic terms. But I'm going to turn this issue over to my colleagues who are much more immersed in Catholic happenings for their response.
So this is it's an interesting moment in one way. Francis has captured the attention of the world, and when we look back to the beginning of his papacy, seemingly every statement of his had the attention not just of the Catholic world, but of the media at large, and that's died down considerably. I think there is a certain exhaustion around his pontificate, or a kind of decrease in interest from various quarters. He's recaptured it at this moment. It's not entirely novel in a couple ways. One, it's known that Francis doesn't always speak in a prim manner in private. And additionally, Francis has long been critical of what might be described as, campier aspects of Catholic clerical life. His long-running and widely celebrated war on the so-called trads, on people who are more attached to the Latin Mass or to more traditional forms of piety, has included him criticizing young seminarians who wear saturnos, these wide-brimmed hats, or are interested in lace. Some Catholics seem to believe more lace, more grace, right? More lace, more grace. Francis doesn't think that way, and his rhetoric has long suggested that he sees something a little unmanly in all of this stuff. And so his invocation of Forcagine, or however it's said, really is in keeping with previous attacks of his. I don't know that this was in the context of criticism of traditionalists. He's also critical of liberals in various ways, but I guess I would say for more liberal listeners who are trying to understand this, where could this come from? I thought the Pope was good and all this. Actually, some of the things that have been celebrated about Francis, including his attack on traditionalists, are quite closely connected to this widely condemned use of a slur.
I also just want to pick up on Matthew's last theme, which is the Holy Father's kind of earthy Latin character, and it has to do with, that this is not new or a shock. If you guys remember, around the time of Archbishop Vigano's expose, Revelations, Archbishop Vigano himself has gone completely crazy, but he did recount a story, for what it's worth, where I think the Holy Father, in an American context, or during his American visit in 2014, or when he had American prelates visiting him in Rome, at any rate, he told them, you got to be careful. Don't be I'm paraphrasing here to be clear, but you can look it up. Don't be too right-wing like some of the American right-wingers are, but also don't be too left-wing. And by left-wing, I mean gay. So if Vigano is right, that's just kind of who he's like. He's an Argentinian guy, and I don't know. So I like the way it scrambles. I like the way it scrambles the kind of settled categories about how to read this pontificate. Obviously, there was a great deal of anger on the left among very kind of public Jesuits who are, some of whom are explicitly pushing to change church teaching on the status of homosexual desire and so on. And then, but also, I this one I haven't looked up as much. Maybe Matthew has, but like, how are the trads reading this? Because it, from a certain trad reading, which I think is largely overblown. This is a pope who is determined to, just throw overboard all the sort of church's moral certainties, and I don't think that's true. And certainly, like, doctrinally, I continue to insist nothing has changed. But so therefore, like, how are they reading this? Like, are they saying like, great, Francis is on our side? Are they? I don't know. I haven't looked into it, but it's a kind of curious phenomenon because it scrambles their categories as well.
Yeah, I don't know, Sohrab, how those people are reading. It's a good question. I do want to get Geoff in here on the Argentine angle. You kind of alluded to.
No, this is just pure stereotyping, but it is generally thought among people in other parts of South America. If you talk to like Peruvians or Colombians or Ecuadorians, that they'll often, if you ask them to characterize Argentines, they'll say, well, they're quite foul mouthed. Like, I remember like a Peruvian telling me, he like went and stayed with a family in Argentina, and that he was shocked by like the fact that a kid would say something like the equivalent of that, like when addressing his mom would be like, "Son of a bitch, mom, that's crazy," or something like that. That this would be regarded as inappropriate elsewhere, but that basically this is kind of this kind of more rough language is more widespread in Argentina, and that it has that kind of that kind of culture of informality, and in which profanity is kind of interlaced with conversation. So I don't know. This is just something I haven't done a comparative study, but it's certainly something you will hear people say. And so, I think clearly Francis is sort of being, is being scapegoated here for his cultural identity, I think, is the takeaway. He's just expressing himself as a good, son of Argentina does.
Yeah, Cardinal Supich of Chicago famously, this was around the same time as the Vigano revelations, said, the Pope's critics are racist because he's the first Latino pontiff, and I just think that
Latinx to you, sorry.
Exactly right, but I stand corrected. But just the funny, I mean, he's like an Italian, in terms of his heritage, who grew up nationally, citizenship wise Argentine. So the idea that
well,
you have like a native Pope, a native Latin.
You have to think of Argentina basically as a country whose heritage is like 60% of people have the same descent, or 60 to 80% of people, I would say, have more or less the same descent as like the characters in The Sopranos. So just think of that as like that's the entire country. Is basically people descended from Southern Italian kind of, rough-hewn working class immigrants, from like Sicily and Naples. So just imagine the guys in this, the shit talking of the guys in The Sopranos, like that's pretty much the whole country.
But soprano guys who got really into psychoanalysis generally, and Lacanian psychoanalysis specifically. Yes. That's just right. The one odd thing.
Tony would be going to instead of the sort of more generic psychodynamic Jennifer Melfi, he'd be going to like a strict Lacanian. If it was set in Argentina.
I'm just grateful that the Vatican is not based in Germany. Otherwise, the Pope might be facing many years in prison for his statement. And with that, I'd like to thank Sohrab, Matthew, Geoff, and Stephen, our producer. Don't forget to subscribe at compactmag.com if you haven't already. And thank you for listening.